You wake up. There is no alarm. There has never been an alarm. The concept of an alarm, of a device specifically designed to interrupt sleep at a predetermined moment for the purpose of forcing you into productive activity, does not exist yet and will not exist for approximately 300,000 years. What wakes you is something considerably more immediate: the light, the particular quality of early morning light filtering through the trees above your sleeping place, hitting your eyelids with the gentle insistence of a sun that has been doing this job since long before you existed and will continue doing it long after you are gone. You are lying on a bed of leaves and dry grass, under an overhang of rock that has been your group's sleeping place for the past several weeks. Around you, the other members of your band are stirring. The fire from last night has burned down to coals, still alive, still warm, casting a faint orange glow in the pre-dawn dimness. Someone will need to feed it soon. Several people are still asleep. A child is making the preliminary sounds that will, if not addressed, become full crying in approximately 30 seconds. You have no schedule. You have no job. You have no commute, no mortgage, no performance review, no email inbox, no social media feed, no to-do list. You have no currency, no property tax, no retirement savings, no health insurance. You have absolutely none of the administrative infrastructure that modern human beings spend a substantial fraction of their waking lives managing. What you do have is considerably more immediate and considerably more demanding. You need to eat today. You need to drink. You need to make sure your group is safe. You need to maintain the social relationships that are, in the world you live in, your primary survival technology. And you need to do all of this without any of the tools, institutions, or accumulated knowledge that subsequent generations of humans will spend hundreds of thousands of years developing. You are a member of the species Homo sapiens, living approximately 100,000 years ago in what is now sub-Saharan Africa. And the question of what you actually do between now and when you go to sleep tonight, what the first fully modern humans really did with their days, is one of the most fascinating, most thoroughly investigated, and most consistently misunderstood questions in all of human prehistory. Because here is what most of us imagine when we think about early human daily life: a grim, exhausting, brutish struggle for survival. Constant hunting, constant danger, constant hunger. A life, as Thomas Hobbes famously put it, though he was describing a philosophical thought experiment rather than actual prehistory, that was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And here is what the actual evidence from archaeology, from anthropology, from the study of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, from primatology, from paleontology, from genetics, suggests instead. Our ancestors probably worked less than you do. They slept more than you do. They had more leisure time than you do. Their social lives were richer, more consistent, and more deeply satisfying than those of most people in modern industrialized societies. Their diet was more varied and, in many respects, more nutritious. Their physical fitness was extraordinary by any modern standard. Their mental lives were complex, creative, and engaged with a richness of sensory and social experience that the modern world, for all its conveniences, has largely eliminated. This does not mean prehistoric life was paradise. It was not. The mortality rates were brutal, particularly for children. Violence was real. Pain was managed without medicine. The specific anxieties of prehistoric life, predators, injury, starvation in bad seasons, the deaths of people you loved without any framework to predict or prevent them, we're genuinely terrible in ways that we have largely mercifully been insulated from. But the day-to-day texture of that life, what the first modern humans actually did between dawn and dark, was not the grim survival marathon of popular imagination. It was something considerably more human, considerably more interesting, and considerably more relevant to understanding who we are and why we are the way we are. Let's find out what it actually looked like. Chapter 1. Waking Up. The first hours of a prehistoric day. The morning begins, as we established, without an alarm. But that does not mean it begins gradually or peacefully in the way that modern people imagine sleeping naturally to mean. The prehistoric morning was full of information, and the prehistoric brain, which is, let us be clear, exactly the same brain you are using to watch this video, because 100,000 years is not enough time for significant cognitive evolution, was processing that information the moment consciousness returned. The smell of the air. What does it tell you? Rain coming? Smoke from somewhere unexpected? The specific scent of a predator that has been in the area? The direction of the wind, which matters enormously for what you will be able to smell for the rest of the morning, and which will influence where you decide to go. The sounds. What is normal for this time of morning in this place, and what is not? The birds. And here is a specific form of knowledge that almost no modern human possesses, but that our ancestors possessed comprehensively. The birds are a constant information broadcast. Different species calling at different times. Alarm calls that indicate a predator's presence and direction. Silence where there should be sound, which is frequently more alarming than noise. A person who grew up in this landscape, who has been listening to it since infancy, who has been specifically educated in its sounds by every adult in their community. This person hears the morning soundscape the way a skilled musician hears a complex piece of music, extracting layers of meaning that are simply inaudible to the untrained ear. The light, not just its brightness, but its quality, its color, what it tells you about the time of year and the weather and the day ahead. People who live outdoors and navigate by natural light develop a sensitivity to its qualities that is genuinely difficult to describe to people who spend most of their lives under artificial illumination. The angle of sunrise changes noticeably from day to day across the year. The color of the sky at dawn predicts the weather with a reliability that the old sailors' rhyme. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in morning, sailor's warning, has preserved in folk knowledge. Our ancestors read this information automatically from long habit. All of this is happening before anyone has stood up. The anthropologist Louis Liebenberg, who spent years studying the tracking and environmental knowledge of the San people of the Kalahari, one of the most thoroughly studied contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, has described the information processing demands of hunter-gatherer life as comparable to those of a scientist. The tracker reads the environment the way a scientist reads data, forming hypotheses, testing them against new evidence, revising conclusions as information accumulates. This process begins the moment you wake up and does not stop until you sleep. The sleeping arrangement itself is worth examining. For most of human prehistory, people did not sleep alone or in nuclear family units. They slept in groups. The archaeological evidence for sleeping sites, ancient hearths, surrounded by areas of compressed soil and organic material, consistently shows communal sleeping arrangements. A typical hunter-gatherer band of 20 to 50 people would sleep close together, often around a fire, in a configuration that provided warmth, protection, and, more crucially, social connection. Sleep research on contemporary hunter-gatherer groups has produced findings that consistently overturn modern assumptions about natural human sleep. Jerome Siegel's team at UCLA conducted accelerometry studies of sleep in 3 traditional hunter-gatherer groups, the San of Namibia, the Tsimane of Bolivia, and the Hasda of Tanzania, and found that these groups typically sleep between 6 and 7.5 hours per night, not the 8+ hours that sleep researchers often recommend for modern people. They go to sleep several hours after sunset and wake slightly before or at sunrise. They rarely nap during the day, and they report significantly lower rates of insomnia than modern Western populations. This last finding is striking. The hunter-gatherers sleep less, but sleep better. The reasons probably include the complete absence of artificial light, which disrupts circadian rhythms, consistent physical activity during the day, and sleeping in groups. The proximity of other humans appears to have a genuinely calming effect on the nervous system that evolved over millions of years of communal sleeping. The transition from sleep to waking in a hunter-gatherer camp is not the abrupt, alarm-enforced binary of modern experience. It is a gradual process, different people waking at different times, the camp coming slowly to life as the light increases. The first people awake tend the fire, an act of enormous practical importance, since maintaining fire was a non-trivial undertaking in an era before reliable fire-starting technology. The fire provides warmth against the cold of early morning. It provides light, it provides protection, and it provides the social center around which the morning activity of the group organizes itself. The morning fire is also the morning conversation. Contemporary hunter-gatherer ethnographies consistently document the importance of the early morning social gathering around the fire, a period of informal conversation, information sharing, and social maintenance that functions as the daily news broadcast and planning meeting of the group simultaneously. What did people hear or see during the night? Where is the best food likely to be today? Is the injured member of the group feeling better? Is there news from the neighboring band that was seen at the water source yesterday? This morning conversation is not idle chat. It is essential information processing. The decisions made in the morning around the fire, where to go, what to look for, how to divide the group's activities, are the strategic planning of a small but sophisticated organization, managing its resources in a complex and variable environment. The fact that this planning happens informally, in the context of social interaction, and without written agendas or decision matrices, does not make it less sophisticated. It makes it differently sophisticated, adapted to an information environment and a social structure that formal planning tools are not designed for. Children are present at this morning gathering. They are not sent off to a separate space to be supervised by specialists while the adults talk. They are there listening, occasionally participating, absorbing the knowledge and the decision-making processes of the adults around them through the simple mechanism of being present for them. This is how hunter-gatherer education works. Not in formal lessons, but in continuous immersive participation in the life of the community. The child who sits by the fire every morning for 10 years, while the adults discuss tracking, weather, social relations, and resource management, has received an education of extraordinary breadth and depth, even if no one has ever formally taught them anything. After the morning gathering, which might last anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour depending on the weather, the urgency of the day's needs, and the quality of the conversation, the day's activities begin. And here is where the standard narrative of prehistoric daily life needs the most substantial revision. Chapter 2. The work. How much, how hard, and what kind. Let's address the most persistent myth about prehistoric daily life head on. Our ancestors did not spend most of their day hunting and gathering. This statement will probably strike you as counterintuitive. If you have no agriculture, no stored food, no grocery store, no supply chain, if every meal has to be located and obtained from the wild, surely the obtaining of food must consume the majority of your waking hours. The logic seems ironclad. The logic is wrong, and the anthropologist Marshall Salins was the first person to demonstrate just how wrong it was in an essay published in 1966 that remains one of the most influential and most debated documents in the history of anthropology. Salins drew on fieldwork conducted by anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups in the 1960s, particularly James Woodburn's work with the Hadza of Tanzania and Richard Lee's work with the Kungsan of the Kalahari, to make an argument that was, at the time, genuinely shocking. Hunter-gatherers, Salins argued, worked less than people in agricultural or industrial societies. They spent 3 to 5 hours per day in food-related activities, hunting, gathering, processing, and the rest of their time in what could only be described as leisure, sleeping, talking, playing, making things, visiting, engaging in ritual and ceremony. Salins called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society, not because they were wealthy in the material sense, but because they had achieved the fundamental condition of affluence, having enough. Their needs were modest, their means of meeting those needs were adequate, and the gap between need and satisfaction that drives modern economic anxiety was largely absent. This thesis has been debated and refined for 60 years. Some aspects have been challenged. The specific time estimates vary considerably between different groups and different seasons, and some environments are considerably more demanding than the Kalahari. The idea that all hunter-gatherers everywhere lived in a state of comfortable leisure is clearly an overstatement, but the core observation that hunter-gatherers in adequate environments typically spend substantially less time in subsistence activities than modern people spend in paid employment has held up remarkably well against subsequent research. The most systematic modern attempt to measure hunter-gatherer time allocation is Christopher Boehm's compilation of dozens of ethnographic studies, which found average subsistence time in hunter-gatherer groups, ranging from about 3 hours to about 6 hours per day, with most groups clustering around 4 to 5 hours. The specific number varies by season, by environment, by the specific composition of the group, and by what counts as work. But the consistent finding is that the number is considerably lower than the 8+ hours that modern workers spend in paid employment. Why? How is it possible that people with no tools beyond what they can make themselves, no stored food beyond what they can carry, and no institutional support for obtaining food can spend less time getting food than a person with access to grocery stores, agriculture, refrigeration, and global supply chains? The answer involves several factors that we consistently underestimate. First, the human body, when maintained in the physical condition that hunter-gatherer life produces, is an extraordinarily capable food-obtaining machine. Modern humans who study hunter-gatherer subsistence strategies are consistently impressed by the efficiency of skilled practitioners, the tracker who finds game reliably, the gatherer who knows exactly where specific plants grow at specific times of year, the group that combines its knowledge to be in the right place at the right time with the right techniques. The efficiency comes from knowledge, tens of thousands of hours of accumulated experience about the local environment, applied with a precision that no modern person who has not grown up in that environment can match. Second, the caloric density of the foods that skilled hunter-gatherers access tends to be high. Large game, when successfully hunted, provides enormous quantities of calories relative to the effort involved in obtaining it. Underground storage organs, tubers, bulbs, corms, are calorie-dense and frequently more reliably available than above-ground plant foods. Honey, when found, is extraordinarily calorie-rich. The hunter-gatherer diet is not the sparse, barely adequate subsistence that popular imagination suggests. It is, in adequate environments, a diet of high caloric density, obtained through skilled targeting of the most energy-rich available foods. Third, the social organization of hunter-gatherer food. Getting is highly efficient because it is highly collaborative. Hunting, in particular, is a cooperative enterprise that allows multiple people to accomplish what none of them could accomplish alone. Coordinated drives, relay hunting, ambush tactics developed over generations. These strategies mean that the energy investment per calorie obtained is much lower for a skilled cooperative group than it would be for isolated individuals. So what did our ancestors do with the rest of their time? This is the genuinely fascinating question, and the answer is considerably more interesting than the work question. They talked at extraordinary length and with extraordinary richness. Contemporary hunter-gatherer ethnographies consistently document the centrality of conversation. Not instrumental task-focused conversation, but wide-ranging social, narrative, and speculative conversation in hunter-gatherer daily life. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner analyzed 174 conversations recorded among the Ju'u/Hwanzi San of Namibia and found that daytime conversations were predominantly about economic activities and complaints, while evening conversations around the fire were overwhelmingly, approximately 81%, devoted to storytelling, particularly stories that address the actions and reputations of specific individuals. Gossip, in other words, in the most precise technical sense, the exchange of social information about other members of the community. This is not trivial. Gossip, the management of social reputation through the exchange of information about individuals' behavior, is, anthropologists argue, the primary mechanism by which human social groups manage cooperation and detect cheating at the scale of hundreds of individuals. It is the technology that allows a group to reward pro-social behavior and punish antisocial behavior without requiring formal institutions, laws, or enforcement mechanisms. Robin Dunbar's influential work on the relationship between primate brain size and social group size argues that language itself evolved primarily as a social bonding mechanism, a way of maintaining the complex web of relationships in larger groups than can be managed through the physical grooming that other primates use. In this framework, the hours that hunter-gatherers spend in conversation are not leisure in the sense of wasted time. They are the primary activity of the species' core social technology. Conversation is the work of being human. They slept, not just at night, but occasionally during the day, particularly after midday in hot environments, in the pattern that modern chronobiology increasingly suggests is the natural human sleep architecture. A longer night's sleep and a shorter midday rest, the biphasic sleep pattern that was apparently universal before artificial lighting made continuous wakefulness possible. They played. This is one of the most underappreciated aspects of hunter-gatherer daily life, and one of the most revealing about what work really means in this context. Play, and here I mean play in the full sense, from children's games to adult physical games to the playful element in adult social interaction, is not a break from hunter-gatherer life. It is woven through it. The physical skills that hunting requires are practiced in play. The social skills that cooperation requires are developed in play. The creative problem solving that survival demands is exercised in play. And beyond all of these functional justifications for play, hunter-gatherers simply play because they enjoy it, because the human nervous system, like the nervous systems of all social mammals, is wired to find playful interaction intrinsically rewarding. They made things. The production of tools, weapons, containers, clothing, ornaments, and art was a consistent feature of hunter-gatherer daily life. The archaeological record preserves the durable products of this making. Stone tools, bone implements, shell beads, but the perishable products were probably more varied and more numerous. Baskets, nets, cordage, wooden implements, leather goods, woven plant fiber items. The manufacture of these objects was not purely utilitarian. It was also creative, social, and communicative. The specific designs and decorations on tools and ornaments carried information about the maker's identity, group membership, and social status. They engaged in ritual and ceremony. The evidence for ritual behavior in early Homo sapiens, and even in earlier hominin species, goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Ochre, used in body decoration, and possibly in ritual painting, appears in the archaeological record from at least 300,000 years ago. Deliberate burial of the dead, which implies some form of belief about death, and what follows it, appears by 100,000 years ago. Music, percussion, probably also wind. Instruments appears in the archaeological record by 40,000 years ago, though the actual practice is almost certainly older. Ritual was not a luxury that early humans added to their lives once survival was secured. It was, from very early in our species' history, an integral part of daily and seasonal life. And they did nothing in particular. They sat in the sun. They watched things. They groomed each other, literally in the physical sense of picking through hair and skin, the activity that occupies enormous amounts of time in other primate species, and that in humans is partly replaced by conversation, but probably not entirely. They existed in a state of sensory engagement with their environment that the modern world, with its relentless mediation of experience through screens and schedules and institutional demands, has made genuinely difficult to access. This is not idealization. It is description based on the best available evidence. And it tells us something important about the mismatch between the life our nervous systems evolved for and the life most of us actually live. Chapter 3. The hunt. What it actually looked like now. Let's talk about the hunting, because even if it took less time than we imagined, it was still central to prehistoric life. And the reality of it is both more impressive and more interesting than the simple image of a person with a spear chasing an animal. You are tracking. You have been tracking for 2 hours. Around you, the landscape is a text, a complex, constantly updated document written in signs that you have been learning to read since childhood. The bent grass, the disturbed soil, the pattern of hoof prints that tells you not just that an animal passed here, but what kind of animal, how long ago, how fast it was moving, whether it was alarmed or relaxed, whether it was healthy or injured. You're reading this text as fluently as you read the written words of this script, actually more fluently, because you have been doing it for decades, and the stakes of getting it wrong have always been real. The tracking of large game by early humans is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated cognitive achievements in human history. Louis Liebenberg's work with Kalahari sand trackers has produced some of the most detailed documentation of what tracking actually involves, and his conclusion is striking. Expert tracking requires the same basic cognitive skills as scientific reasoning. The tracker forms a hypothesis about the animal's identity, location, and behavior from incomplete evidence. They test that hypothesis against new evidence as they follow the trail. They revise their model when the evidence demands it. They use knowledge of animal behavior, terrain, weather, and season to extrapolate beyond what the direct evidence shows. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is inference, systematic, disciplined, evidence-based inference of a kind that requires extensive knowledge and active reasoning. The expert tracker who looks at a set of footprints and tells you that the animal was a young male wildebeest, that it passed approximately 4 hours ago, that it was moving at a relaxed walk with a slight tendency to favor its left foreleg, and that it was probably heading toward a specific waterhole 3 kilometers to the northeast. This person is not doing something magical. They are doing science, applied, embodied, very high-stakes science. The physical demands of hunting are also substantially greater than popular representations suggest. Modern researchers studying persistence hunting, the practice of running game to exhaustion, which appears to have been a significant hunting strategy for early humans, have found that it requires sustained running over distances of 10 to 30 kilometers, often in the heat of the day when large animals quickly overheat. But humans, with their extraordinary sweating capacity, can continue to move. The persistence hunters of the Kalahari, documented in film and in scientific literature, are running at a sustained pace for hours across difficult terrain in temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. This requires a level of cardiovascular fitness that most modern humans cannot approach. The evolutionary adaptations that make humans such effective persistence hunters are extraordinary and specific. We are the only primate and one of the very few mammals capable of sustained running over long distances in the heat. Our bare skin, our extraordinary density of sweat glands, our ability to breathe independently of our stride, unlike most quadrupeds, which must coordinate breathing with their gait. Our arched foot, our long legs, our large gluteus maximus muscles that stabilize the trunk during bipedal running. All of these features appear to have been shaped, at least in part, by selection for effective hunting. Daniel Lieberman's research at Harvard on the evolution of human running has produced the compelling argument that Homo sapiens is, in biomechanical terms, a specialized long-distance running animal, not the fastest runner. We are far outpaced by most quadrupeds over short distances, but the most capable endurance runner among mammals, able to maintain a running pace over distances that would cause most other animals to collapse from heat exhaustion. In the heat of an African day, a human hunter can quite literally run a wildebeest to death. The weapons used in hunting evolved over an enormous time span, and the specific weapons available at any given point significantly influenced what hunting looked like. The earliest reliable evidence for projectile weapons, spear points that show the characteristic fracture patterns of having been thrown, dates to approximately 300,000 years ago. Before this, the primary hunting weapon appears to have been the thrusting spear, a long shaft with a hardened point, used at close range. The transition to thrown projectiles, and eventually to the spear thrower, atlatl, which dramatically increases the range and velocity of thrown spears, represents a major technological advance that changed the risk profile of hunting substantially, because hunting with a thrusting spear requires getting very close to a large and often dangerous animal. This is not something that is done casually or without considerable risk. The archaeological record of hominin injuries, including healed fractures in patterns consistent with being struck by large animals, tells us clearly that hunting was genuinely dangerous. The broken bones and crush injuries preserved in fossil hominin skeletons look, according to paleoanthropologist Mary Steiner and others who have analyzed them, strikingly similar to the injury patterns seen in modern rodeo riders, people who routinely get thrown, kicked, and gored by large animals. Hunting was therefore not just physically demanding, it was psychologically demanding, requiring the ability to manage fear, to make rapid decisions under pressure, and to coordinate with other hunters in real time without verbal communication that might alarm the prey. The social choreography of a cooperative hunt, the silent signals, the flanking movements, the timing of the charge, represents a form of nonverbal coordination that is extraordinarily sophisticated. Watching video documentation of Hadza men hunting in Tanzania or Kalahari San hunters tracking an approaching game, you see something that looks less like an athletic activity and more like an improvised dance, complex, responsive, dependent on each participant's ability to read and anticipate the movements of both the prey and their partners simultaneously. The emotional dimensions of the hunt are also important and also underrepresented in popular accounts. The success of a hunt, particularly the kill of a large animal, was not just a practical event in the life of a hunter-gatherer band. It was an occasion of genuine, powerful emotion, the relief of hunger anxiety, the pride of successful skill application, the complex feelings associated with killing a large and sometimes magnificent animal. The ritual practices that surround hunting in documented hunter-gatherer cultures, the prayers or apologies addressed to the killed animal, the specific rules about how the animal must be butchered and distributed, the songs and dances that mark a successful hunt, suggest that early humans experienced the hunt as a morally and spiritually significant act, not merely a food procurement activity. The distribution of the kill is one of the most important social events in hunter-gatherer life. The question of who gets what is not decided by the hunter who made the kill. In most hunter-gatherer cultures, the successful hunter has specific obligations to share the meat widely, often giving the best portions to others and keeping relatively little for themselves. This extreme sharing ethic is not merely altruism. It is a social insurance mechanism. The hunter who shares generously today has a claim on the generosity of others when he returns empty-handed tomorrow. The meat-sharing networks of hunter-gatherer bands represent a sophisticated risk-pooling system that smooths out the high variance of individual hunting success into a more reliable community-level food supply. The failure of a hunt, which happens considerably more often than success, is also an important social event, managed through specific cultural practices that prevent the social and emotional costs of failure from becoming too great. The jokes and teasing that accompany a failed hunt in many hunter-gatherer cultures are not cruelty. They are a social technology for normalizing failure and maintaining the hunter's willingness to try again tomorrow. The hunter who can laugh at today's failure, who can participate in the community's affectionate mockery of his empty-handed return, will hunt again tomorrow without the accumulated weight of humiliation that would eventually make the psychological cost of trying too high. This is, if you think about it, a sophisticated approach to managing the psychology of effort and failure. Modern workplaces spend significant resources trying to create cultures that normalize failure and encourage risk-taking. Hunter-gatherer bands had this figured out tens of thousands of years ago, encoded in the social rituals around the failed hunt. Chapter 4. The Gathering, the underrated half of hunter-gatherer life. The gathering part of hunter-gatherer subsistence has received approximately 1/10 of the scholarly attention devoted to the hunting part, which is unfortunate for several reasons. The most important of these reasons is that gathering, the collection of plant foods, insects, honey, shellfish, small animals, and other non-hunted foods, typically provides the majority of the calories in hunter-gatherer diets, not hunting, gathering. In the ethnographic record, most hunter-gatherer groups obtain somewhere between 50 and 80% of their calories from gathered foods, with the proportion varying by latitude and season. In tropical and subtropical environments, the environments closest to those of early Homo sapiens in Africa, plant foods typically dominate the diet. The Kungsan of the Kalahari, when studied intensively by Richard Lee in the 1960s, obtained approximately 60 to 80% of their calories from gathered plant foods, with the Monkongo nut alone, a calorie-dense, protein-rich wild nut, providing a substantial fraction of the total. The knowledge required for effective gathering is as sophisticated as the knowledge required for effective tracking, but it operates across a different dimension, botanical knowledge, rather than zoological knowledge, the distribution and phenology of plants, rather than the behavior of animals. An experienced gatherer in a familiar environment carries a comprehensive mental map of where specific plants grow, when they are in season, how to process them to maximize nutritional value and minimize toxicity, and how environmental conditions in a given year have affected their distribution and abundance. This last point is critical. Many plants have natural defense chemicals that make them difficult to eat unless properly processed. Underground storage organs, tubers, bulbs, roots, often contain toxic compounds that must be leached out with water, neutralized with heat, or broken down through fermentation before the food is safe to eat. The knowledge of how to process these foods safely represents an accumulated body of information that could only have been developed through generations of experience and occasional costly mistakes. Your gathering. You left the camp an hour ago with 2 other women, following a route that you have walked dozens of times before, that your mother walked before you, that your grandmother described to your mother. The landscape along this route is organized in your memory not by landmarks, but by food sources. The patch of wild tubers that always produces well after the first rains. The termite mound where you can collect larvae in the right season. The fig tree that your group has been monitoring for weeks as the fruit approaches ripeness. The specific rocky hillside where the medicinal plants grow that are needed for the sick child back at camp. You are not wandering. You are executing a sophisticated foraging plan based on knowledge of this landscape that is specific, current, and continuously updated. When you come to the tuber patch and find that something, baboons probably from the signs, has been here before you and taken the largest of the accessible ones, you're not merely disappointed. You're updating your mental model of the resource and your plan for the rest of the route. The physical work of gathering is substantial. Digging for underground storage organs with a digging stick, the primary tool of female foragers in many hunter-gatherer societies, requires considerable physical effort, particularly in the compacted dry soils of semi-arid environments. The Hadza women, studied by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, and her colleagues were found to dig for tubers for hours per day in some seasons, expending significant energy in activity that requires both strength and skill to perform efficiently. The loads carried back to camp, bundles of roots, tubers, fruits, and other foods, can be substantial, often carried on the back or head over distances of several kilometers. The gathering group is a social unit as well as a food procurement unit. The hours spent gathering together are hours of conversation, information exchange, childcare coordination, and social maintenance. Children accompany gathering groups from infancy, carried on the back when very young, walking alongside when older, gradually learning the botanical knowledge and the landscape navigation that they will need as adults. The social context of gathering is one of the primary educational environments of hunter-gatherer children, and the knowledge transmitted in it about plants, about the landscape, about the social dynamics of the group is transmitted through participation and observation rather than through formal instruction. The gendered division of labor that characterizes most hunter-gatherer societies, with men more involved in hunting and women more involved in gathering, is real but considerably less absolute than popular representations suggest. Women hunt in many hunter-gatherer societies, particularly smaller animals and birds. Men gather in all of them, though typically less systematically than women. The division is better understood as a statistical tendency with significant overlap, rather than a rigid assignment of roles. In the relative contribution of each activity to the group's diet means that the traditionally female-associated activity of gathering is, by caloric contribution, the more important of the two, a fact that has not always received appropriate acknowledgement in either popular or scholarly accounts. The gathering of honey deserves a special mention because it represents one of the most remarkable human-animal partnerships in the archaeological and ethnographic record. The Greater Honey Guide, a bird species found in sub-Saharan Africa, has developed a cooperative relationship with human foragers in which the bird leads humans to bee nests. The humans open the nests and harvest the honey, and the bird gets access to the beeswax and larvae that remain. This partnership requires both species to understand each other's signals and to maintain a relationship of reliable reciprocity over time. The honey itself is one of the most calorie-dense foods available in the hunter-gatherer diet. Pure sugar and fat, extraordinarily valuable in an environment where calories are the primary limiting resource. The smoke used to subdue bees before opening their nest, blown from a burning bundle of plant material specifically selected for its irritating smoke, requires both knowledge of which plants produce effective smoke and skill in managing the fire. Honey collection, observed among the Hadza and other African hunter-gatherer groups, is a skilled and somewhat dangerous activity that involves climbing trees, manipulating fire, managing bee stings, and extracting comb from the nest with efficiency born of long practice. The sweetness of honey and the human craving for it is one of the most ancient flavor preferences in our species, reflecting millions of years of selection for the ability to identify and prioritize calorie-dense foods in an environment where calories were not guaranteed. The modern human craving for sugar, which drives one of the most significant public health crises of our time, is the evolutionary legacy of ancestors for whom finding something sweet was a genuinely rare and genuinely valuable event. Chapter 5. The Children Growing Up Before Civilization. Let's talk about the children, because understanding how children spent their days in prehistoric societies is one of the most revealing windows into the fundamental differences between the life humans evolved for and the life most modern humans actually live. A child in a hunter-gatherer band does not go to school. This is the obvious starting point, but the implications of this fact run much deeper than simply no homework. the entire structure of childhood, the relationship between children and adults, the way knowledge is transmitted, the balance between supervision and autonomy, the role of play in development, is fundamentally different from the childhood of modern industrial societies. You are 7 years old. You woke up with the rest of the camp, ate some food left from last night's meal, and are now doing exactly what you want to do, which is to say you are playing. Specifically, you and 4 other children of approximately your age are attempting to build a small fire. Real fire, with real materials, using the technique you have watched adults use since you were old enough to pay attention. You have not been given permission to do this. You have not been supervised. The adults are aware of what you are doing. Nothing that happens in a camp of 25 people escapes adult notice. And they are not intervening because you are not doing anything that is genuinely dangerous to yourself or others, and because the skill you are practicing is one that you will need to have mastered in another few years. This is how hunter-gatherer children learn, not through structured instruction, but through observation, imitation, and free play that is often direct practice of adult skills. The developmental psychologist Peter Gray, who has written extensively on the evolution of play and its role in learning, argues that the free play of hunter-gatherer children, play that is self-directed, intrinsically motivated, and embedded in the actual environment and actual activities of adult life, is the educational system for which the human brain is specifically designed. The curiosity, the imitation, the risk-taking, the social experimentation that characterize children's free play are not byproducts of childhood. They are the mechanism by which human children acquire the knowledge and skills they need. Hunter-gatherer children play with real tools, small versions of adult tools, or actual adult tools when they can get their hands on them. They practice hunting with small bows and blunt arrows, fishing in small streams, digging for roots with small digging sticks. They build small versions of the structures they see adults build. They imitate the social interactions. They observe the negotiations, the arguments, the care of younger children in ways that are recognizable as social rehearsal. David Lancy, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying childhood across cultures, has documented a pattern he calls the weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic model of childhood as a historical and cultural outlier, the intensive, heavily supervised, structured childhood of modern Western society, with its formal schooling, its age-segregated peer groups, its emphasis on verbal instruction, and its radical restriction of children's independent activity, is not the human norm. It is a recent historical development, possible only in societies wealthy enough to remove children from productive activity and specialized enough to require formal transmission of complex technical knowledge. For most of human history, children learned by being present in the world of adults, by observing and imitating, and by playing freely, in environments that were not specially designed for children's safety. The risks this entailed were real. Childhood injuries were common, and childhood mortality from all causes was high. But the developmental benefits, the self-direction, the practical competence, the social intelligence, the intrinsic motivation, were also real and represent the developmental package that human childhood evolved to produce. The relationship between children and adults in hunter-gatherer bands is also fundamentally different from the modern parent-child dyad. Children in hunter-gatherer societies are raised by the group, not just by their biological parents. Multiple adults, the mother, the father, the grandparents, aunts and uncles, older siblings, other unrelated adults, all contribute to a child's care and socialization. The concept of alloparenting, care of young by individuals other than the biological parents, is thought to be one of the key innovations of human social organization, enabling the unusually long and resource-intensive human childhood by distributing its costs across the social group. Grandmothers, in particular, appear to have been crucial in the evolution of human childhood. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by Kristen Hawkes and colleagues, proposes that the post-reproductive lifespan of human females, the decades of healthy active life after menopause that are unusual among primates, evolved because grandmothers made a critical contribution to the survival of their grandchildren. Grandmother presence has been documented to significantly improve grandchild survival in multiple historical and contemporary populations. The hunter-gatherer grandmother who gathers food efficiently and contributes it to her grandchildren is, in evolutionary terms, increasing her own reproductive success by increasing the survival of organisms carrying her genes. The grandmother who knows where the best food is, who can process plant foods efficiently, who can care for young children while parents are foraging. This person is not simply a pleasant presence in camp. She is a crucial survival resource, and her presence in the lives of the children she helps raise, telling stories, transmitting knowledge, providing the kind of patient attention that younger adults with their own survival demands cannot always provide, represents one of the most important educational relationships in human prehistory. Chapter 6: The Social World. Relationships, politics, and the art of getting along are in the middle of a disagreement. Not a violent one. Not yet, and hopefully not ever, because violence within the group is one of the most dangerous things that can happen in a world where your survival depends on the cooperation of the 25 people around you. But a disagreement nonetheless. Two men in the camp have been in increasingly tense conflict over the past week, and the rest of the group has been watching, commenting quietly to each other, and in the way that hunter-gatherer groups characteristically manage internal conflict, beginning to apply the specific social pressures that are the primary mechanism for keeping the peace in a society with no police, no courts, and no formal authority structures. The social world of early Homo sapiens was not simple. It was not the hierarchical, dominance-structured society of our closest primate relatives, the chimpanzees, in which power is organized through physical intimidation and coalition warfare. Nor was it the egalitarian paradise of romantic imagination, in which everyone was equally happy and conflict was unknown. It was something more complex and more interesting than either of these images, a society that had developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing the tension between individual interests and group interests, and that achieved a degree of equality, particularly between adult males. That is, genuinely unusual among social mammals, but through effort and social technology rather than through the absence of the impulse to dominate. Christopher Boehm, the anthropologist, whose work on the evolution of human morality is among the most important in the field, spent decades analyzing the ethnographic literature on hunter-gatherer social organization and identified a pattern he calls reverse dominance hierarchy. In most hunter-gatherer societies, the coalition of subordinates, essentially everyone except whoever is trying to establish dominance, actively suppresses the dominance attempts of individuals. They do this through ridicule, through criticism, through ostracism, and in extreme cases, through the ultimate sanction, execution of persistent bullies, or tyrants by group consensus. This is not a small claim. Boehm is arguing that human beings evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of group selection, the specific psychological and social capacities to resist, the kind of alpha male dominance that characterizes chimpanzee and gorilla societies. The result is a species that has strong hierarchical tendencies. The impulse to dominate is real, and we see it expressed in every complex society that has ever existed, but that also has strong countervailing tendencies toward equality, fairness, and resistance to illegitimate authority. Both of these tendencies are genuinely human. The tension between them is genuinely human. And the social technologies that manage this tension, the gossip, the ridicule, the moral norms, the coalition building, are among the most important products of human cultural evolution. Let's look at how this plays out in daily life. The group of 25 to 50 people that constitutes the typical hunter-gatherer band is small enough that everyone knows everyone else intimately. There are no strangers in the band. There are no private lives in the modern sense. Everything you do is potentially visible to everyone around you, and your reputation, what people think of you, how they talk about you around the evening fire, is one of your most important possessions. Your reputation determines who will cooperate with you, who will share food with you, who will support you in conflicts, who will care for your children when you are incapacitated. A good reputation is survival insurance. A bad reputation is dangerous. The management of reputation is therefore a constant and serious business. The social intelligence required to navigate a hunter-gatherer band, to know who is allied with whom, who owes what to whom, who has been behaving well, and who has been cheating on sharing obligations, who is reliable in a crisis, and who is not, is, by any measure, substantial. And it is precisely the kind of social intelligence that evolutionary psychologists argue the expanded human brain evolved primarily to support. The social brain hypothesis, developed by Robin Dunbar, proposes that the dramatic increase in brain size that characterizes the genus Homo over the past 2 million years is primarily explained by the increasing complexity of the social environment that our ancestors navigated. The cognitive demands of tracking social relationships, managing alliances, detecting deception, and maintaining a reputation across a group of dozens of individuals, all while competing for resources, managing coalitions, and raising children, drove selection for the expanded prefrontal cortex that is the most distinctive feature of the human brain. In other words, we are smart because our social lives were complicated. The intelligence that put humans on the moon evolved in the context of small groups of people figuring out how to get along with each other and detect who was cheating on the meat-sharing agreement. The conflict management mechanisms of hunter-gatherer societies are as instructive as the conflict-generating tendencies. The primary tool is what might be called leveling, the systematic deflation of anyone who tries to place themselves above others. Successful hunters are expected not to boast about their kills. In fact, in many hunter-gatherer cultures, it is expected that the successful hunter will actively downplay his achievement, attributing success to luck, and that others will playfully criticize the kill. The meat is stringy. The animal was small. Any fool could have caught this one. This ritualized deflation of success is not genuine criticism. It is social technology, preventing the accumulation of prestige that might tip into dominance. The specific social dynamics of the two men in conflict scenario that open this chapter are managed through a predictable sequence. First, other members of the group begin to comment on the conflict, not confrontationally, but in the pervasive gossip network that keeps everyone informed about what is happening. Second, respected members of the group begin to apply social pressure, not by adjudicating the dispute formally, because there is no formal authority to do so, but by making their views known in conversation, by shifting alliance signals, by making it clear to both parties that the continued conflict is damaging their standing in the group. Third, if social pressure fails, the ultimate sanction is exclusion, being effectively pushed out of the group, which in a world where survival depends on the group is approximately as serious as a death sentence. The resolution that typically emerges is not a formal decision about who was right. It is a negotiated face-saving that allows both parties to step back from the conflict without either one having to admit defeat, because the point is not justice in the abstract, but the restoration of the group's ability to function cooperatively. This is, if you examine it clearly, a remarkably sophisticated conflict resolution system for a society with no formal institutions. It is also, empirically, a fairly effective one. Hunter-gatherer societies are not violence-free, but the rate of lethal violence within the group is managed down to levels that allow long-term cooperation. The violence that does occur is typically between groups rather than within them, which is a whole other story. The relationship between bands, the larger social world beyond the immediate group of 25 to 50 people, was also a constant feature of social life. Most anthropologists believe that the relevant social unit for early Homo sapiens was not the band alone, but the band society, a network of bands that maintained regular contact, exchanged members through marriage, shared information, cooperated in times of need, and maintained the cultural continuity that gave them a shared identity. The size of these band societies, typically estimated at 150 to 250 individuals, based on both ethnographic evidence and Dunbar's theoretical work, represents the scale at which the human social brain can maintain genuinely personal relationships. The Dunbar's number of approximately 150 that has attracted considerable popular attention. The maintenance of relationships with other bands required periodic gathering, the coming together of multiple bands at times, and places where resources were sufficient to support larger groups. These gatherings, which are documented ethnographically and can sometimes be inferred archaeologically from the clustering of activity sites, were occasions of enormous social and cultural importance. Marriage arrangements, which typically required marrying outside the immediate band, were negotiated. Trade goods, including the raw materials for tool production that needed to travel long distances from their geological sources, were exchanged. Shared ceremonies and rituals were performed, and the social bonds between bands, which were the safety net that allowed a band to seek refuge with others in times of drought or other resource failure, were refreshed and renewed. These interband gatherings were also almost certainly occasions for the transmission of cultural information, stories, songs, ritual knowledge, technological innovations across the network. The speed with which new technologies and new symbolic systems spread across hunter-gatherer networks in the archaeological record suggests a social infrastructure for cultural transmission that was active and efficient. Ideas like genes were moving through the band network regularly. Chapter 7. The food. What they ate and how they ate it. Your eating. This is, let's be honest, one of the most important things you do all day. Not just in the narrow sense of caloric intake, but in the full social, sensory, and emotional sense that eating has carried for our species since before we were fully human. The meal around the fire is not merely nutrition, it is community, it is ritual, it is pleasure. It is the daily ceremony that marks the end of the day's effort and the beginning of the evening's social life. What is on the metaphorical menu for early Homo sapiens is a question that has attracted enormous scientific and popular interest, partly because it has genuine implications for our understanding of modern human health and nutrition. The paleo diet movement, the attempt to reconstruct and replicate the nutritional patterns of our hunter-gatherer ancestors for health benefits, is based on the premise that human beings are best adapted to eat what their ancestors ate, and that the modern diet's departure from ancestral patterns explains many contemporary health problems. This premise has genuine merit as a starting point, even if the specific dietary recommendations of the paleo diet movement are often oversimplified or outright wrong. Let's look at what the actual evidence, from stable isotope analysis of ancient bones, from dental calculus studies, from the ethnographic record of contemporary hunter-gatherers, and from the chemical analysis of archaeological food residues, tells us about what early humans actually ate. The first and most important conclusion is that early human diets were highly variable. There is no single ancestral diet. The Kung San of the Kalahari eat predominantly plant foods with significant animal protein. The Inuit of the Arctic eat predominantly animal foods with very few plant foods, not because they don't like plant foods, but because the Arctic environment doesn't provide them in usable quantities. The Hadza of Tanzania eat a diet that includes large amounts of honey, significant plant foods, and variable amounts of meat, depending on hunting success. The Andaman Islanders eat enormous quantities of seafood. The diversity of environments that Homo sapiens inhabited by 100,000 years ago, from tropical forests to savannas to river valleys to coastlines, required dietary flexibility, and our species has it. What is consistent across hunter-gatherer diets is not the specific foods, but certain nutritional characteristics. Hunter-gatherer diets are generally high in fiber, much higher than modern Western diets, because whole plant foods and wild game contain far more fiber than processed foods and domestic meat. They are generally high in micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals, because the diversity of wild plant foods eaten provides a broader range of micronutrients than the relatively narrow range of domesticated crops that dominate modern diets. They are generally lower in simple carbohydrates and higher in complex carbohydrates than modern Western diets, because the wild plant foods available to hunter-gatherers are less energy-dense than the domesticated grains and sweetened foods that dominate the modern diet. The bone chemistry of ancient Homo sapiens, analyzed through stable isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen, tells us about the broad categories of food consumed. High nitrogen-15 ratios indicate high animal protein intake, the signature of significant meat, fish, or shellfish consumption. Carbon-13 ratios tell us about the types of plants eaten, specifically whether the diet included plants using the C3 photosynthetic pathway. Most temperate plants, including most fruits, nuts, and tubers, or the C4 pathway, tropical grasses and sedges, and the animals that eat them. The isotopic signatures of early Homo sapiens remains from African sites suggest diets that combined significant plant food consumption with significant animal protein, consistent with the generalist omnivory that characterizes most documented hunter-gatherer societies. Dental calculus, the mineralized plaque that accumulates on teeth and is preserved in archaeological skeletal remains, has become an extraordinarily productive source of information about ancient diets because it traps and preserves microscopic fragments of food, plant DNA, and even proteins from the foods consumed. Calculus studies of ancient hominin teeth have identified starch granules from specific wild plant species, phytoliths from grasses and sedges, plant proteins, and in some cases even the DNA of specific plant and animal species consumed. This direct evidence of what specific individuals ate provides a level of dietary detail that isotope analysis cannot reach. The cooking of food, which dramatically increases the caloric availability of both plant and animal foods by breaking down cell walls and denaturing proteins, was a critical development in human evolution, whose timing is debated, but whose importance is not. Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis proposes that the control of fire and the regular cooking of food was a major driver of human evolution. Specifically, that the increased caloric availability of cooked food allowed the reduction of the large digestive system that characterized earlier hominids and freed the energy budget for the larger brain. That characterizes Homo sapiens. The evidence for habitual fire use and cooking goes back at least 1 million years in the hominin lineage, and possibly significantly earlier. By 100,000 years ago, the period of early anatomically modern humans, fire was almost certainly used routinely for cooking, warmth, protection, and social gathering. The hearth, the fire around which the group gathered, was the center of social life, and the cooking done around it was not a simple or unreflective activity. The processing of plant foods in particular required substantial knowledge and effort. Many wild tubers and roots are tough, fibrous, and difficult to chew raw. Cooking softens them and makes their calories accessible. Many plant foods contain tannins, alkaloids, or other secondary compounds that make them unpalatable or mildly toxic raw, and that are reduced or eliminated by heat. The knowledge of which foods to cook, how to cook them, and how to combine them for maximum nutritional effect was not trivial. It was a sophisticated applied chemistry developed through generations of empirical observation and transmitted through cultural learning. The sharing of food was as important as the food itself. We mention the meat sharing networks around the successful hunt, but food sharing in hunter-gatherer societies extends well beyond the distribution of large game. The general principle is one of radical sharing. Food that exceeds what the gatherer can consume is shared with others in the group with an expectation, not always explicitly articulated but reliably present, that the sharing will be reciprocated. This generalized reciprocity is the foundation of hunter-gatherer economic life, and it creates a food security system that is, within the limitations of the local environment, remarkably robust. The specific foods available to early Homo sapiens in sub-Saharan Africa included a remarkable variety of items that modern humans rarely encounter. Underground storage organs, the wild ancestors of domesticated yams, sweet potatoes, and other root vegetables, were nutritionally valuable and reliably available across seasons when above-ground plant foods were scarce. Wild fruits, including many species that have not been domesticated and remain virtually unknown outside of their native range, provided sugar, vitamins, and in many cases significant protein from seeds. Insects, termites, caterpillars, grasshoppers, beetle larvae were and remain important protein sources in African hunter-gatherer diets, typically processed by roasting or boiling. Shellfish and fish were important along coastlines and rivers, providing high-quality protein and critical micronutrients, including omega-3 fatty acids and iodine. The evidence that early Homo sapiens exploited coastal and riverine resources extensively has been significantly strengthened over the past 2 decades by archaeological work at sites in South Africa, particularly Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point, that have revealed intensive shellfish exploitation dating to at least 165,000 years ago. The consumption of shellfish at these sites, evidenced by enormous middens of discarded shells, suggests that early humans were not merely opportunistic coastal foragers, but were systematically exploiting marine and estuarine resources as a major component of their diet. This coastal exploitation may have been particularly important in periods of climatic stress, the cold, dry periods during glacial maxima, when the interior of Africa became less hospitable, and coastal resources may have provided the nutritional foundation that allowed our species to survive. The coastal refugia hypothesis proposes that early Homo sapiens populations retreated to productive coastlines during climatic downturns, maintaining population size and cultural continuity on the basis of marine resources, and then expanded back into the interior when conditions had improved. If correct, this hypothesis would make the early exploitation of coastal resources not merely a dietary footnote, but a key factor in human survival through the challenging climate of the late Pleistocene. Chapter 8: The Night, Fire, Stories, and the Invention of the Human Mind. The sun is going down. In the world of early Homo sapiens, this transition, which modern humans manage with a switch and barely notice, was one of the most significant events of the daily cycle. Darkness was dangerous. The nocturnal predators that shared the African landscape with our ancestors, lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, were far more effective hunters at night than in the day, and early humans without artificial light were genuinely more vulnerable after dark. The firelit camp was the solution, a circle of warmth and light that created a zone of relative safety in the surrounding darkness. But the campfire did more than provide safety. It extended the usable, social time of the day. Before fire, the transition from day to night marked a relatively sharp transition from active social life to sleep. The darkness that made predators dangerous also made complex social interaction difficult. Fire changed this. The firelit evening, the hours between sunset and sleep, became, in the emerging social life of Homo sapiens, a uniquely important time. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner's analysis of Zhu Huanzi San Conversations, which we mentioned in Chapter 2, found that the character of conversation changed dramatically between day and evening. Daytime conversations were practical, focused on economic activities, complaints about specific individuals, and current events. Evening conversations around the fire were different. They were dominated by stories, specifically by the kind of narrative storytelling that involves distant times and places, supernatural agents, moral lessons, and the full range of human experience extended beyond the immediate present. Wiesner argues that this firelit storytelling was not merely entertainment. It was and is the primary mechanism by which human beings expand their social imagination beyond the immediate present, by which they think about people and situations they have not personally experienced, by which they develop theories of mind sophisticated enough to predict the behavior of people they have never met, and by which they transmit the moral and social knowledge of the group across generations. The stories told around the fire are the curriculum of the hunter-gatherer university, and attendance is universal. What did these stories sound like? We cannot know with certainty what stories were told around fires 100,000 years ago. The specific content is gone, carried away on the wind of the uncountable evenings between then and now. But we can make some educated guesses based on the structure of human storytelling universals. The narrative patterns that appear across virtually all human cultures, and that are therefore likely to be ancient, and on the mythological traditions of peoples who maintained relatively uninterrupted cultural continuity from deep prehistory. The stories almost certainly involved animals. In the hunter-gatherer relationship with the animal world, Animals are not merely food or danger. They are persons. They have intentions, they have social relationships, they have moral qualities. The attribution of personhood and intentionality to animals, which modern Western culture tends to regard as childish anthropomorphism, is, in the hunter-gatherer framework, a sophisticated epistemological stance. The recognition that other beings in the environment have inner lives that influence their behavior and that must be understood for effective interaction. The stories told about animals around the fire were partly informational, about specific animals' behaviors and habitats, and partly moral, about how the proper relationship between humans and other animals should be conducted. The stories almost certainly involved the dead. The relationship between the living and the dead is one of the oldest and most universal concerns of human narrative tradition. The dead, particularly the recently dead, who were known personally, retained a presence in the social world of the group that needed to be managed narratively. Their deeds were remembered, their advice was invoked, their presence in some form, beyond physical death, was asserted. The elaboration of beliefs about the afterlife, about ancestor spirits, about the proper conduct of mourning. All of this was worked out in the stories told around fires, constituting the earliest theology of our species. The stories almost certainly involved the origin of things. How did the world come to be? Why is fire hot? Why do animals behave as they do? Why do people get sick and die? The human compulsion to explain, to place experienced events in a narrative framework that connects them to causes and to meanings, drove the development of cosmological and ideological narratives that address these questions. The specific answers varied enormously across cultures, but the questions were constant, and the storytelling mode was universal. The music that accompanied the evening fire is less accessible to us than the stories. Sound leaves no direct archaeological trace, but its importance in early human life is not in doubt. The bone flutes found at archaeological sites in Europe, dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, are the oldest confirmed musical instruments in the archaeological record. But they are almost certainly not the oldest music. Percussion instruments, the human voice, clapping and stamping, and the various ways of producing rhythm from the body and from the environment require no durable materials and leave no archaeological trace. And the behavior of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups suggests that music, in the broad sense of organized sound, was an integral part of daily and especially evening social life, long before any instrument was made from lasting material. Music does things to the human brain that language does not. It synchronizes physiological states between people, heart rate, brainwave activity, breathing, in ways that create a genuine experience of shared emotion and shared identity. Group singing and group dancing, which appear universally in human cultures, activate the brain's reward systems in ways that reinforce social bonds and group cohesion. The evolutionary explanation for music is therefore probably similar to the evolutionary explanation for laughter. It is a social bonding technology, a way of bringing people into physiological alignment and generating the felt sense of being together with others that is the subjective experience of group cohesion. Robin Dunbar's research on music and social bonding has found that group singing raises pain thresholds. That is, it increases the release of endorphins, the neurochemicals that produce the sense of well-being associated with physical contact between social animals. Group singing around the fire is, in biochemical terms, like a large-scale mutual grooming session. It produces the neurochemical signature of social bonding in everyone who participates simultaneously. As a group cohesion technology, it is extraordinarily efficient. The laughter that punctuated the evening fire deserves its own attention. Humor, the production of unexpected cognitive juxtapositions that generate the specific response of laughter, is a universal human behavior with deep evolutionary roots. Chimpanzees produce a vocalization during play that is functionally analogous to human laughter, but human laughter is more elaborated, more socially complex, and more central to social life than the laughter of any other primate. We laugh alone at things we are thinking about. We laugh at stories. We laugh at the performance of humor, the deliberate construction of incongruity in ways that are specifically human. The humor of hunter-gatherer evening life, documented extensively in ethnographic accounts, is not gentle or polite by modern standards. It is direct, physical, frequently scatological, and often involves the kind of deflation of pretension and status that we identified as the leveling mechanism. The man who returned from the hunt empty-handed is teased. The person who ate too much is mocked. The pompous elder who puts on airs is brought back to earth with a story that makes everyone laugh. This humor is social maintenance. It manages hierarchy, reinforces egalitarian norms, and releases the tension that accumulates in any group of people living in close quarters without personal space. The children who are present at the evening fire and who go to sleep when they are tired rather than at an externally imposed bedtime are absorbing all of this. The stories, the music, the laughter, the social dynamics, all of it is curriculum. The child who falls asleep to the sound of adult conversation and laughter around the fire, who wakes at some point in the night to the warmth of nearby bodies and the faint sound of breathing, is having an experience that the human nervous system has been calibrated to expect for tens of thousands of years. The night itself, the hours between sleep and waking, was probably not the unbroken sleep block that modern humans in well-lit environments typically experience. Research on pre-industrial sleep patterns, including Roger E. Kirch's historical work and the hunter-gatherer sleep studies we mentioned earlier, suggests that biphasic sleep, a first sleep, a period of waking in the middle of the night, and a second sleep, may be the natural human pattern. The middle of the night waking in a hunter-gatherer context is not alarming or pathological. It is a time of quiet wakefulness, of lying in the dark, of the half-dreaming state between sleep phases in which certain kinds of thinking, associative, symbolic, memory-consolidating thinking, appear to happen particularly readily. This is, some sleep researchers speculate, the state in which some of the most creative and most profound human cognitive work happens, the kind of thinking that is not directed and goal-oriented, but free associative and integrative. The artist who finds a solution to a creative problem upon waking in the night, the mathematician who intuits a proof in the semi-dream state, the writer whose characters suddenly become clear in the small hours. These experiences may be accessing a mode of cognition that evolved in exactly these nocturnal quiet hours, in exactly the kind of environment that prehistoric humans inhabited. Chapter 9. The Art, Creativity and Symbolic Thought. In early human life, you're looking at a hand. It is pressed against the rock wall of a cave, outlined in red ochre. The artist blew pigment around their hand to create a negative image, a shape that is simultaneously an absence and a presence. The hand is from approximately 40,000 years ago, left by a person at a site in what is now Sulawesi, Indonesia. It is the oldest confirmed example of figurative art in the archaeological record. But here is what is remarkable about that hand. Look at it closely. It is not technically different from your hand. the same 5 fingers, the same proportions, the same basic architecture. The person who left it had a brain neurologically indistinguishable from yours. They were having, at the moment of making it, an experience that is recognizable. The desire to leave a mark, to say I was here, to create something that extends their presence beyond their physical body into the world. That impulse to make, to decorate, to represent, is one of the most distinctively and most persistently human impulses in our evolutionary heritage, and the evidence for it goes considerably further back than 40,000 years, even if the clearest examples of what we unambiguously recognize as art cluster in the Upper Paleolithic period. Ochre, iron oxide, the red mineral pigment, appears in the archaeological record of human sites going back at least 300,000 years, long before anatomically modern Homo sapiens. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, ochre pieces dating to approximately 75,000 years ago show evidence of deliberate engraving. Geometric patterns scratched into the surface of the ochre pieces. Small shells from the same site show traces of ochre and appear to have been pierced or stringing as beads. The ochre pieces from Blombos have been interpreted as evidence of symbolic thinking. The use of a material not for its immediate practical utility, but for its communicative or representational properties. The use of ochre in body decoration, painting the skin with red pigment, is documented in virtually every contemporary hunter-gatherer society that has been studied, and it is almost certainly ancient. Body decoration is not merely aesthetic. In hunter-gatherer societies, the specific patterns and colors of body decoration carry information about the individual's group membership, social status, ritual state, and individual identity. The person decorated with the marks of their band's specific symbolic system is, in a real sense, wearing their social identity on their skin. This is communication, complex, intentional, symbolic communication, of exactly the kind that separates human culture from the signaling systems of other animals. The shell beads of Blombos and similar beads found at sites across Africa and the Near East dating to 100,000 years ago or more are significant because beads require an extraordinary amount of cognitive and cultural infrastructure to make sense of. A bead by itself is meaningless. It becomes meaningful only in a context where everyone in the relevant social group understands that this object, worn in this way, means something specific. The existence of beads therefore implies the existence of a shared symbolic system, a cultural code that assigns specific meanings to specific objects, which is in turn evidence of the kind of language and cultural transmission that we associate with fully modern human cognition. The production of tools was itself, in some sense, an artistic practice. The Acheulean hand axes, produced by Homo ergaster and early Homo sapiens over hundreds of thousands of years, are, in many examples, considerably more symmetrical and more finely worked than their functional requirements would demand. Some examples are so large and so carefully made that they appear to have been produced as demonstrations of skill rather than for practical use, what archaeologists call luxury or prestige tools, made to show what the maker could do rather than to accomplish any specific cutting task. The production of an exceptionally fine hand axe was, in this interpretation, a performance of skill and an assertion of quality, a form of self-expression in stone. The music making that we discussed in the previous chapter was also an art practice. The bone flutes found at sites in Europe and in Germany dating to approximately 40,000 years ago are made with a care and a technical sophistication that goes well beyond what would be needed for a simple noisemaker. They are tuned, the holes are spaced to produce specific pitches, which implies a conception of music as more than random sound, a framework of tonal relationships that needed to be built into the instrument deliberately. Making a functional flute requires understanding acoustics, materials science, and tonal systems. Making a beautiful flute, which some of these ancient examples clearly are, requires aesthetic judgment on top of all of this. The cave paintings of the Upper Paleolithic, the spectacular art of Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and dozens of other sites in Europe are the most famous products of early human artistic life, and also the most frequently misunderstood. They are not, as they are sometimes presented, the first art. The tradition of symbolic expression and body decoration that precedes them is at least 75,000 years old. They are rather a specific fluorescence of visual art in a specific environment, the painted caves of southwestern Europe and southern France, during a specific period of approximately 30,000 years, from about 40,000 to 10,000 years ago. The specific content of the cave paintings is instructive about what the first humans cared about and thought about. The overwhelming majority of identifiable images are animals: horses, aurochs, bison, rhinoceroses, mammoths, deer, bears, lions. The animals are depicted with an accuracy and an expressiveness that continues to astonish modern viewers. The Chauvet cave paintings, dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, show animals in motion: a rhino charge, a lion hunt, horses in a line, rendered with a dynamism and a naturalistic accuracy that required both exceptional observational skill and exceptional graphic ability. Why animals? The most obvious explanation is that animals were the most important feature of the environment, the primary source of both food and danger, the beings whose behavior most needed to be understood and predicted, the entities whose presence in the world was most charged with significance. But the animal images in the caves are not mere records of animal observation. They are charged with something else, a quality that art historians and anthropologists call presence, the sense that the image is not just a representation of an animal, but a kind of summoning of it, an assertion of the animal's reality and power. The specific locations of cave paintings, deep in the interior of caves, often in areas accessible only through difficult passage, in spaces where the natural formations of the rock were apparently incorporated into the images, suggests that the making and viewing of these images was a ritual practice rather than a casual decoration project. People were not painting their living quarters. They were going deep into the earth, into spaces of darkness and isolation and acoustic strangeness, to make images in places that few people would see. This suggests that the making of the images, the act of creation, was the point, as much as or more than the viewing of them. The ochre-stained hands and the precise animal drawings and the carefully strung shell beads tell us something fundamental about the people who made them. They were thinking symbolically. They were representing the world to themselves and to each other through systems of shared meaning. They were, in other words, fully human, in the sense that matters most, cognitively, culturally, experientially. The person who pressed their hand against the rock in Sulawesi 40,000 years ago and blew red pigment around it to leave their mark was doing something that you can understand immediately, intuitively, without any explanation, because it comes from the same place in the human mind that makes you want to be remembered, to leave something behind, to say, I was here, I existed, I mattered. Chapter 10, The Medicine: Health, Pain, and Healing Without Hospitals. You have a broken tooth, not the kind of broken tooth you'd have today. A minor inconvenience addressed with a dental appointment and some local anesthetic and a crown. A prehistoric broken tooth, one that is cracked at the root, is acutely inflamed, is sending signals of pain up your jaw and into your head that are competing effectively with your ability to think about anything else. And you have no dentist, you have no ibuprofen, you have no antibiotics for the infection that is beginning to develop in the socket. What do you have? More than you might think, but also less than you need. And the outcome of this particular situation, tooth root abscess in the world before antibiotics, is not guaranteed to be good. The health of early Homo sapiens was not, as popular imagination sometimes suggests, uniformly terrible. The skeletal record of prehistoric humans shows people who were, on average, physically robust, well-nourished, well-muscled, with good bone density and healthy teeth by the standards of the populations that succeeded them. The agricultural revolution, when it came, actually produced a temporary deterioration in average human health. The skeletal record of early agricultural populations shows increases in nutritional deficiency diseases, dental caries, tooth decay from high carbohydrate diets, and infectious diseases compared to the hunter-gatherers they replaced. In several measurable respects, the transition to farming made the average person's health worse, not better. Hunter-gatherer health had genuine advantages. A varied diet provided a broad micronutrient profile that prevented the specific deficiency diseases, scurvy, pellagra, beriberi, that became common when agriculture narrowed the diet to a few staple crops. Regular varied physical activity produced cardiovascular fitness and musculoskeletal health that is almost impossible to replicate in sedentary modern lifestyles. The low sugar content of the hunter-gatherer diet compared to the high simple carbohydrate content of agricultural diets protected dental health, except in populations with access to honey, where dental caries appear in the archaeological record at rates similar to agricultural populations. The infectious disease burden, however, was genuinely different in kind, if not always in severity. Many of the most deadly infectious diseases of the historical period, smallpox, measles, influenza, plague, are diseases of density. They require large, sedentary, closely packed human populations and slash or domestic animals to maintain transmission chains. Hunter-gatherer bands, with their small size, their mobility, and their distance from domestic animals, were somewhat protected from these particular diseases, though they faced their own infectious challenges from waterborne pathogens, vector-borne diseases like malaria, and the parasitic infections that came with eating wild game. The injuries of hunter-gatherer life were substantial. Falls, animal attacks, hunting injuries, and interpersonal violence all produced the broken bones, skull fractures, and joint injuries that appear in the skeletal record. And here, the medical response that was available is genuinely interesting, because hunter-gatherer groups had not nothing. They had empirical medicine of considerable sophistication. The pharmacopoeia of early humans, the plant medicines available in the African savanna and forest environments, is not known with certainty, but we can make reasonable inferences from the convergence of several lines of evidence. Contemporary hunter-gatherer groups use a wide range of plant medicines, and the plants used medicinally by different groups in similar environments often overlap significantly, suggesting that effective medicinal plants were identified and their uses were established well before the group's cultural traditions diverged. Some of these plants contain compounds with genuine pharmacological activity, anti-inflammatory, analgesic, antimicrobial, anthelmintic, that justify their traditional use from the perspective of modern chemistry. Willow bark, which contains salicin, the precursor of aspirin, was almost certainly used by early humans for pain and fever management. The use of willow bark as a medicinal plant appears across multiple independent cultural traditions in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, and modern chemical analysis confirms that the salicylates in willow bark are genuinely effective analgesics and anti-inflammatics. The plants used to treat wounds, which include many species with genuine antimicrobial or wound healing properties, were also probably known and used. The management of the gut with plant medicines for diarrhea, constipation, intestinal parasites is one of the most consistent uses of medicinal plants across hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide. The social and psychological dimensions of healing in hunter-gatherer societies are as important as the pharmacological ones. The healer, the person in the band with the most developed knowledge of medicinal plants and healing practices, was also a ritual specialist, because in the hunter-gatherer worldview, illness was not a purely physical event. It had social and spiritual dimensions that needed to be addressed alongside the physical symptoms. The healing ceremony, which typically involves the healer entering an altered state through rhythmic drumming, dancing, or the use of psychoactive plants, and then seeing the source of the patient's illness in the spiritual realm and addressing it there, is documented across hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide with a consistency that suggests it is very ancient. The San healing dance, in which the healer enters trance through hours of rhythmic dancing and then passes healing energy through touch to the patient, is one of the most thoroughly studied examples. Modern interpretations of these practices tend to emphasize the role of altered states of consciousness in activating endogenous healing processes, the pain relief, the immune modulation, the reduction of stress responses, that the ritual generates in the patient through expectation, social support, and the physiological effects of the ceremony itself. The social support that surrounds illness in hunter-gatherer communities is not incidental to healing. The research on the relationship between social connection and health outcomes, which is now one of the most robust findings in health psychology, with the strength of social ties predicting outcomes for everything from cardiovascular disease to cancer to recovery from infection, suggests that the consistent social support available in a hunter-gatherer band represents a genuine health resource. The sick person who is cared for by the entire group, who is never alone, whose illness is addressed by communal ritual as well as by practical care, is receiving a form of treatment that modern medicine is only recently beginning to appreciate and to supplement. The broken tooth is going to hurt for a while. It may be treated with poultices of plant material, willow bark, certain resins, medicinal herbs that reduce inflammation and slow infection. The community will acknowledge the suffering, will adjust their activities around it, will provide food that the sufferer can eat without the affected side of the mouth. The healer will perform a ceremony, and the immune system will fight the infection with whatever resources it can muster. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. The skeletal record of prehistoric humans shows healed infections alongside unhealed ones, successful fracture repairs alongside ones that killed the patient. The outcomes were genuinely variable, but the care, the systematic, socially supported, pharmacologically grounded, ritually reinforced care, was real. These people were not passive sufferers of fate. They were active managers of health and illness, with a sophisticated toolkit for doing so. Chapter 11. The Spiritual Life, Religion, Ritual, and the Sacred Before Civilization. You're standing at the edge of the world, not the edge of the physical world. You know perfectly well that the savanna continues beyond the horizon, that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, that the world is large and filled with things beyond your direct experience. But you are standing at the edge of something, the place where the visible ends and the invisible begins. The boundary between the ordinary world of daily life and the world that your tradition says lies behind it, beneath it, within it. You are about to enter a trance. The drumming has been going on for 3 hours. Around you, the entire community is present. Children, elders, adults, clapping, singing, sometimes adding their voices to the rhythmic pulse that has been building steadily since sunset. Your feet have been moving for most of that time, the repetitive shuffle step that has covered tens of kilometers in the course of the night without taking you anywhere. The sweat is soaking your clothing. Your vision has begun to shimmer at the edges. The physical world is becoming simultaneously more and more vivid and less solid. The numb, the spiritual energy that your tradition describes as the vehicle of healing and of contact with the spirit world, is rising in your chest. This is not metaphor. This is your subjective experience, as real as the ground under your feet, as real as the drum beat that is no longer something you hear, but something you are. The boundary between the music and your heartbeat has dissolved. You're no longer an individual body at the edge of the group. You are the group, and the drum beat, and the night, and something beyond all of these. You are a sand healer in southern Africa, performing the healing dance that your people have practiced for at least 27,000 years. The minimum age of rock art that appears to depict the trance dance in the Drakensberg Mountains. You are doing the most ancient religious practice in the world, and you are having an experience that, whatever its ultimate ontological status, is as real and as transformative as any experience available to a human nervous system. The religious and spiritual life of early Homo sapiens is one of the most difficult aspects of prehistoric life to reconstruct, and one of the most important. Difficult because the specific beliefs, rituals, and cosmological frameworks of prehistoric peoples left only fragmentary material traces. Important because religion and ritual appear to be universal features of human culture. There is no documented human society without some form of belief in beings or forces beyond the ordinary physical world, without some form of ritual practice to engage with those forces, without some framework for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead. The universality of religious behavior in human cultures is not proof of religion's truth. That is a separate question that this script is not going to try to answer. But it is strong evidence that religious and ritual behavior is ancient, that it was present in the ancestral human population before the cultural traditions of modern human populations diverged. The question of when and how human religious behavior first emerged is therefore a question about the deep prehistory of human cognition. The evidence suggests that the capacity for religious experience, the specific cognitive architecture that generates beliefs in supernatural agents, that creates the experience of the sacred, that produces the awe and terror and wonder associated with religious encounter, is built into the human nervous system. Pascal Boyer's research on the cognitive foundations of religion proposes that beliefs in supernatural agents emerge naturally from the application of ordinary cognitive tools. Agent detection, intentional attribution, pattern recognition to ambiguous situations. We evolved to be extraordinarily sensitive to the presence of intentional agents in our environment, because mistaking a lion for a bush is fatal, but mistaking a bush for a lion is just embarrassing. This sensitivity applied beyond the situations it evolved for, generates perceptions of intention and agency in wind, thunder, disease, luck, and the other ambiguous forces that hunter-gatherers encounter daily. The specific form that early human religion took is not recoverable in detail, but several themes emerge consistently from the archaeological and ethnographic evidence. The belief in spirits, in the continued existence of the dead in some form, and in the existence of non-human spiritual beings in the natural world, appears to be universal and ancient. The deliberate burial of the dead, which implies beliefs about what happens after death, appears in the archaeological record of Homo sapiens by at least 100,000 years ago, and in Neanderthals even earlier. The specific form of these beliefs varied enormously, but their consistent presence suggests that the human mind generates beliefs about death and what follows it as naturally as it generates beliefs about anything else. The relationship with the animal world had spiritual dimensions that were probably inseparable from its practical dimensions. The animals that provided food, that provided danger, that shared the landscape with early humans were understood as beings with intentions, with social relationships, with spiritual significance. The killing of an animal for food was not a neutral act. It was a morally and spiritually loaded event that required acknowledgement, propitiation, and the maintenance of a proper relationship between the human hunters and the animal world they depended on. The specific practices associated with this relationship, the prayers before the hunt, the apologies to the killed animal, the specific rules about how the carcass must be treated, are documented across hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide and represent a remarkably consistent ethical framework for the human-animal relationship, the sacred geography of the hunter-gatherer world, the specific places that carried spiritual significance, that were the sites of encounters with supernatural forces that marked the boundaries between the ordinary world and the world behind it, was as real and as important as the economic geography of food and water sources. Caves, in particular, appear to have been consistently understood as liminal spaces, boundaries between the human world and the world beyond. Across cultures and across time, the consistent use of deep caves for art and ritual, from the European Upper Paleolithic to Australian Aboriginal traditions to Native American rock art traditions, suggests that something specific about the cave environment, its darkness, its acoustic properties, its isolation from the ordinary world, reliably generated experiences of the sacred. The altered states of consciousness associated with religious experience, trance, vision, mystical union, were accessed through a range of techniques that appear consistently across hunter-gatherer traditions. Rhythmic drumming and dancing, sensory deprivation, fasting, and the use of psychoactive plants. The convergence of these techniques across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests that they are effective, that they reliably produce altered states with specific qualities that are experienced as religiously significant. The neuroscience of these states is now sufficiently developed to understand, at least in outline, why they work. They activate specific neural circuits, modulate neurotransmitter systems, and produce specific patterns of brain activity that generate the experiences of unity, presence, and encounter that are the subjective core of religious experience. The social function of religion in hunter-gatherer life was as important as its individual experiential dimension. Shared ritual, the experience of performing the same actions, singing the same songs, moving in coordinated patterns together, produces the neurochemical signature of social bonding that we discussed in the context of music. The shared religious experience is one of the most powerful group cohesion mechanisms available to human societies, capable of generating a felt sense of unity that overrides individual differences and reinforces collective identity. The healing ceremony that we open this chapter with is a perfect illustration of this. The sand healing dance is simultaneously a therapeutic practice for specific sick individuals, a community-wide ritual of renewal and cohesion, and a collective experience of the sacred. The healer enters trance and addresses the illness in the spirit world. The community that surrounds the healer with drumming and singing is not merely accompanying the healer, it is providing the energy that the healer uses, entering a less intense version of the altered state themselves, collectively addressing the disruption that illness represents. When the ceremony ends, the group has been through an experience together. They have sweated together, sung together, been afraid together, hoped together. They are, in the most literal physiological sense, more bonded to each other than they were before. This is what religion did for early human societies. It made the group more than the sum of its individuals. It created the experience of collective identity that allowed humans to cooperate at scales and with a reliability that would otherwise not have been possible. The Durkheimian insight that religion's primary social function is the creation and maintenance of collective identity turns out, in the light of modern cognitive science and evolutionary anthropology, to be substantially correct. Religion is not primarily about explaining the world, though it does that. It is primarily about creating and sustaining the group. Chapter 12. The violence, conflict, war, and the dark side of prehistoric life. We need to talk about the violence, because the picture of prehistoric daily life that this video has been building, the rich social life, the varied diet, the creative spiritual practice, the playful children, the satisfying leisure, is accurate but incomplete. It is incomplete because it does not adequately account for the darkness that was also part of early human experience. And that darkness, while not as dominant as the Hobbesian nightmare of constant brutal struggle, was real and sometimes devastating. The evidence for interpersonal violence in prehistoric populations comes from several sources that are more informative than they might first appear. Skeletal trauma, the specific patterns of bone damage that are characteristic of weapon injuries, as opposed to the patterns produced by animal attacks or falls, appears in the fossil record of Homo sapiens and even earlier hominins with a frequency that leaves no doubt that violence between humans was a regular feature of life. Healed weapon injuries tell us about survivors. Unhealed weapon injuries tell us about the situations that were fatal. The specific patterns of violence documented in prehistoric skeletal assemblages are informative about the social contexts in which violence occurred. Some sites show patterns consistent with interpersonal violence between individuals, the kind of one-on-one aggression that happens in the context of personal disputes within or between groups. Other sites show patterns consistent with collective violence. Multiple individuals in the same site, showing weapon injuries, the kind of pattern produced by raids or battles between groups. The most dramatic example of prehistoric collective violence, currently known, is the Natarik site in Kenya, dated to approximately 10,000 years ago. Here, the skeletal remains of at least 27 individuals, men, women, and children, show evidence of violent death, arrow wounds, blunt force trauma to skulls, and in some cases, the skeletal indicators of binding before death. This was not a battle between two organized forces. It was a massacre, the killing of a group of people, including children, apparently in a deliberate raid. Some of the victims show evidence of being bound, suggesting capture before killing. Nataruk is not unique, though it is among the most complete and dramatic sites of prehistoric violence currently documented. Similar evidence of collective violence, mass graves with evidence of weapon injuries, sites with multiple victims showing the same type of trauma, appears at various prehistoric sites across Africa, Europe, and the Americas, spanning tens of thousands of years. What does this tell us? The honest answer is something real, but something that needs to be interpreted carefully. The existence of prehistoric violence does not mean that violence was constant or that prehistoric life was defined by war. The violence at sites like Nataruk was episodic. These events were dramatic enough to leave clear evidence precisely because they were exceptional. The daily life of the group that was massacred at Nataruk in the days and weeks and years before the Dome attack was probably much more like the daily life described in the earlier chapters of this script than like the violent event that ended it. The anthropologist Douglas Fry, in his analysis of violence in hunter-gatherer societies, distinguishes between different types of conflict. Individual interpersonal disputes, which are common but rarely fatal in societies with strong social norms against within-group killing, and collective intergroup violence, which is less frequent but potentially catastrophic when it occurs. The Hobbesian image of a world of constant war conflates these two very different phenomena and produces a picture of universal constant violence that the evidence does not support. At the same time, the other extreme, the image of a prehistoric world free of significant violence in which war was invented only with agriculture and social complexity, is also not supported by the evidence. Collective intergroup violence appears to predate agriculture. The specific conditions that produce it, resource competition, group identity formation, the ability to coordinate collective action, were present in hunter-gatherer societies. The violence was real. The most defensible picture is one in which violence was a real and recurring feature of prehistoric life. Not constant, not defining, but present, and occasionally devastating. The psychological landscape of early humans therefore included both the deep satisfaction of rich social connection and the fear, grief, and rage associated with violence and loss. Both of these are deeply human experiences. Our capacity for both, for extraordinary altruism and brutal violence, for profound cooperation and devastating competition, is written into our evolutionary history. The management of this violence was one of the primary functions of early human social organization. The norms against within-group violence. Norms that were enforced through the gossip, ridicule, and ostracism. Mechanisms we discussed in the chapter on social life were not merely cultural conventions. They were survival adaptations, representing the accumulated learning of generations about what happens to groups that allow internal violence to escalate. The groups that managed internal conflict well were more cohesive, more cooperative, and more likely to survive the external threats, including the threat of other groups that all human bands faced. The intergroup violence itself was also subject to cultural management, to the development of rules, protocols, and social relationships between groups that reduced the frequency and severity of attacks. The exchange of women in marriage between bands, which created kinship ties across group boundaries, was one of the most important mechanisms for reducing intergroup conflict because it made members of other groups into relatives rather than strangers. The ceremonial gift giving and hospitality between bands that is documented across hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide served similar functions, creating obligations of reciprocity and social ties that made violence between former trading partners and hosts more costly and less common. The full human picture, in other words, is of a species that evolved both the capacity for extreme violence and sophisticated social technologies for managing and reducing that violence, and that spent its daily life largely in the space between those extremes, navigating the complex social world with the full range of emotional and cognitive capacities that make us human. Chapter 13. The language. Talking before. Writing. Every conversation in this script has involved language. The storytelling around the fire, the morning planning session, the conflict resolution, the teaching of children, the healing ceremony, all of it has language at its center. And yet we have said relatively little about language itself, about what it looked like, what it could do, and what its emergence meant for human daily life. The evolution of language is one of the most debated topics in all of science. The specific question of when fully modern language, with its recursive syntax, its arbitrary symbols, its open-ended productivity, first appeared in the hominin lineage, is genuinely unresolved and may never be fully resolved, because language leaves no direct fossil traces. We cannot look at a skull and know with certainty what kind of language the person who owned it spoke. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that by 100,000 years ago, the period of early anatomically modern Homo sapiens, the physical and neural infrastructure for fully modern language was in place. The modern human vocal tract, capable of producing the full range of human speech sounds. The modern human FOXP2 gene, associated with the fine motor control of speech production. The modern human brain, with the Broca's and Wernicke's areas, and the arcuate fasciculus connections between them that support language production and comprehension. All of these features are present in anatomically modern Homo sapiens and are consistent with fully modern language capacity. Whether that capacity was being fully used 100,000 years ago, whether early Homo sapiens had languages with the syntactic complexity and expressive range of modern languages, is a separate question. The behavioral evidence of symbolic thought, ochre use, beads, deliberate engraving, suggests that the cognitive architecture supporting symbolic language was present. The social complexity of early human bands, the management of dozens of relationships, the coordination of cooperative activities, the transmission of detailed technical knowledge, would have been vastly more efficient with language than without it. The specific languages spoken by early Homo sapiens are completely unrecoverable. Language leaves no archaeological trace, and the languages of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have been evolving for tens of thousands of years and look nothing like whatever was spoken 100,000 years ago. But we can make some inferences about what those languages were probably like, based on the linguistic features that appear to be universal across all known languages, features that are therefore likely to be ancient, and on the specific needs that language would have needed to serve. All known human languages share certain structural features. They have nouns and verbs. They have ways of referring to absent people and things. They have tenses or aspects that locate events in time. They have question forms. They have negation. The universality of these features suggests they are ancient. The specific forms vary. Languages encode these universal functions in extraordinarily diverse ways, but the functions themselves appear to be universal. The language of early Homo sapiens was almost certainly rich in references to the natural world, to specific plants, animals, landscape features, and environmental conditions that were essential to survival. Research on the vocabulary of contemporary hunter-gatherer languages finds extraordinary richness in domains relevant to subsistence. Dozens of words for different types of soil, hundreds of words for different plants, and their parts and conditions, elaborate vocabularies for describing animal tracks and behavior. This specificity reflects the cognitive premium placed on environmental knowledge. In a world where knowing the difference between two similar plants might mean the difference between a nutritious meal and a fatal poisoning, precise language for describing the natural world was a survival tool. The social vocabulary of early human languages was almost certainly equally rich. Languages with complex social structures, and all hunter-gatherer societies have complex social structures, tend to have elaborate vocabularies for social relationships, specific terms for every kinship relationship, for social roles, for the moral qualities associated with good and bad community members. The capacity to talk precisely about social relationships and social behavior was essential for the gossip-based reputation management system that we identified as the primary mechanism of hunter-gatherer social control. The narrative capacity of early human language, the ability to describe events that are not present, to construct hypothetical scenarios, to tell stories about the past, and speculate about the future, was probably one of the most important features of language for daily life. It is this temporal and counterfactual extension of language beyond the immediate present that separates human language most clearly from the communication systems of other animals, and that enables the planning, the teaching, the ritual, and the storytelling that characterize human social life. The child learning language in a hunter-gatherer band was immersed in it from birth, not the simplified, child-directed baby talk that characterizes early language exposure in many modern Western societies, but the full complexity of adult language use in context from the first days of life. The accelerated language development that characterizes human children, the rapid acquisition of vocabulary and syntax in the first few years of life, probably evolved in exactly this kind of rich, contextually embedded language environment, and the human language acquisition device is calibrated to it. The emotional content of early human language was probably not reduced to the instrumental and informational. Language, from its earliest emergence, was almost certainly used for the expression of emotion, for the articulation of grief, joy, fear, desire, and the full range of affective states that characterize human experience. The songs around the fire were not just music, they were language, carrying meaning alongside melody. The stories were not just information, they were emotional experiences designed to produce specific feelings in the listeners. The laughter was not just social signaling, it was the linguistic expression of shared perception of incongruity. In short, the language of early Homo sapiens was probably as rich, as flexible, and as emotionally resonant as any language spoken today. It was different in content. Its vocabulary was calibrated to a different environment. Its metaphors drew on different experiences, but its structure and its function were fully human. And it was talking, constantly, richly, in all directions about everything. The most important technology in the history of this species, deployed every waking moment of every human life, as naturally and as unconsciously as breathing. Chapter 14. The Aging, Growing Old in the Paleolithic. Here is something that might surprise you. Old people have been important for a very long time, not merely tolerated, not merely kept alive as long as possible out of emotional attachment. Genuinely, functionally important. Important for their knowledge, their social influence, their childcare contribution, and their role as the living libraries of a culture without writing. The old person in a hunter-gatherer band is not a burden. They are, in many respects, the most valuable member of the community. We have already discussed the grandmother hypothesis. The evolutionary argument that the post-reproductive lifespan of human females evolved because grandmothers make a critical contribution to the survival of their grandchildren. But the importance of old people in hunter-gatherer societies goes beyond the grandmother effect. It encompasses a more general phenomenon. In societies without writing, without recording technology, without any mechanism for storing information outside of the minds of living people, the old people are the archive. Everything that the group knows about its environment, the locations of water sources that were reliable 50 years ago, but are dry now, the stories of the exceptional flood that changed the river course a generation back, the specific plants that were effective against the illness that swept through the band 30 years ago, the history of the relationships between this band and its neighbors, going back to the grandparents' time. All of this information exists only in the memories of the people old enough to have experienced it, or to have heard about it from people who did. This makes older individuals uniquely valuable in situations that have not been encountered for many years. The rare event that falls outside the experience of the younger members of the group, but within the experience of the oldest. The anthropologist Kim Hill has documented this phenomenon among contemporary hunter-gatherers. In situations of unusual environmental challenge, extreme drought, unusual animal behavior, disease outbreaks, the knowledge of the oldest group members often provides the crucial guidance that younger members lack. The aging process in early Homo sapiens was not, however, free from suffering. The skeletal record of prehistoric populations shows extensive evidence of osteoarthritis, the degenerative joint disease that becomes increasingly prevalent with age. In older individuals, and in the absence of modern pain management, this would have been significantly disabling. Tooth wear, the progressive wearing of tooth enamel through decades of chewing tough, grit-laden food, was universal and eventually severe enough to compromise the ability to eat. The loss of teeth in old age, before the development of soft foods and food processing technologies adequate to compensate, was a genuine health threat. But the care of the elderly within hunter-gatherer bands, the adjustment of food sharing to provide soft, easily chewed foods to those who could no longer manage hard foods, the accommodation of reduced mobility in the group's movement patterns, the genuine emotional attachment that the elderly occupied in the social world of the band, represents a form of elder care that, while not always adequate, was genuine and consistent. The evidence of healed injuries and managed chronic conditions in prehistoric skeletal remains tells us that people who required care were provided with it, that the social support system of the band extended to its most vulnerable members. The death of an old person in a hunter-gatherer band was also different from death in modern societies. Not necessarily less painful, but differently embedded in a social and cosmological framework that gave it meaning. The person who died had lived in continuous, intimate connection with every other person in the group. Their death was a genuine loss, felt by everyone who had known them. And the stories told around the fire after their death, the preservation of their memory, the specific ways they were incorporated into the group's ongoing narrative of itself, were a form of mortality management that made death, however painful, something that could be faced and integrated rather than only feared. The old person's last contribution to the group, the knowledge and the perspective and the specific presence that no one else could provide, was understood as valuable to the end. This is perhaps the most distinctively human aspect of the relationship with aging, the recognition that what a person knows and has experienced and can still offer is not diminished to zero by physical decline. The elder sitting by the fire, no longer able to walk the distances that hunting and gathering require, who tells the stories and makes the decisions and remembers the things that no one else remembers? This person is still doing the work of being human. They are doing it in the way that their specific stage of life allows, and the community that keeps them, feeds them, listens to them, is not being merely kind. It is being rational, protecting an irreplaceable resource, honoring the specific form of value that only age can provide. Conclusion: what they tell us about ourselves. Let's come back to where we started. The morning without an alarm. The fire still glowing from the night before. The child beginning to stir. The day stretching ahead with all its demands and all its possibilities. You know considerably more now about what that day actually looked like than you did at the beginning of this video. You know it involved 3 to 5 hours of food-getting activity, less than a modern workday, and many hours of conversation, play, rest, creativity, and the specific form of engaged presence in the world that we have almost entirely lost the habit of. You know it involved extraordinary physical competence, the tracking knowledge, the botanical knowledge, the physical endurance, the craft skill, the ecological awareness that modern humans have largely outsourced to institutions. You know it involved a rich social life, a constant, intimate, complex web of relationships that provided both the deepest satisfactions and the most pressing challenges of daily existence. You know it involved spirituality of genuine depth, encounters with the sacred in fire and in darkness, in trance and in story, in the specific presence of the natural world, understood as alive with intention and meaning. You know it involved violence, not constant, not defining, but real and sometimes devastating, managed by social technologies that were sophisticated and largely effective. You know it involved creativity, the hands pressed against the rock, the beads strung on cordage, the songs that rose from the fire into the night sky. And you know, because this is the most important and the most uncomfortable thing that the evidence tells us, that the people who lived these days were not our inferiors, not in intelligence, not in emotional depth, not in social sophistication, not in the range and richness of their inner lives. They were us, the same species, the same brain, the same nervous system, the same emotional repertoire. They were living in a different environment with different tools and different information, but they were bringing to that life the full cognitive and emotional capacity of Homo sapiens. What the evidence of early human daily life ultimately tells us is a set of things about ourselves that we would rather not face squarely. It tells us that the human nervous system evolved for a life of rich social connection, and that the epidemic of loneliness documented in modern industrialized societies. The research consistently showing that people have fewer close relationships than they did 50 years ago, that more people live alone, that more people report having no one to talk to about things that matter, is a mismatch between the social environment we evolved for and the social environment we have created. It tells us that the human body evolved for regular, varied, moderate intensity physical activity embedded in purposeful daily life, not for the sedentary 8 hours followed by 30 minutes of gym that is the contemporary compromise, and that the epidemic of metabolic and musculoskeletal disease in modern populations is, in significant part, the biological cost of this mismatch. It tells us that the human mind evolved for a level of direct sensory engagement with the natural world that most modern people almost never experience. The hour-by-hour reading of weather and terrain and animal behavior that characterized daily life in the wild. And that the modern epidemic of nature deficit disorder is real. That human mental health is genuinely supported by contact with the natural world in ways that our designed environments fail to provide. It tells us that human children evolved to learn through free play and direct participation in adult activity, and that the heavily structured, heavily supervised, school-dominated childhood of modern industrialized societies may be in tension with the developmental process that the human brain evolved to undergo. It tells us that the work-life balance that modern people struggle to achieve, the attempt to carve out from a life of institutional obligations some space for the social, creative, spiritual, and physical activities that make life feel worth living, is a struggle against an artificial situation. The first humans did not have a work-life balance problem. They had a life. The work was embedded in the life. The social connection was embedded in the work. The creativity and the spirituality and the play were not scheduled around the productivity. They were woven through it. None of this means we should or could return to hunter-gatherer life. The population of the modern world cannot be fed by hunter-gatherer. Subsistence, the specific diseases, violence, and child mortality of prehistoric life are genuine costs that we have paid real benefits to escape. The accumulated knowledge and the institutional infrastructure and the global cooperation that modern civilization has produced represent achievements of enormous value that a return to small band life would destroy. But the evidence of early human daily life is a mirror in which we can see ourselves clearly, see what we evolved for, what we are, what the nervous system that we carry through our modern days is built to do and built to need. And that clarity, even if we cannot act on it completely, is useful. It tells us what to look for, what to try to preserve, what the things are that make human life feel, in the most biological sense of the word, good. The fire, the story, the hand pressed against the rock, the child falling asleep to the sound of adult voices, the morning light coming through the trees, the human things, the things that have been human for 100,000 years, that will still be human for as long as we persist. They did not need to invent them. They were born into them. We have had to rediscover them painfully by examining the evidence of lives so different from our own that they feel like another species, and finding in that examination that they are not another species at all. They are us. They were always us. And understanding what they did all day is, in the end, one of the most direct paths available to understanding what we are for.